The program will now begin. Welcome to the stage, anchor at Bloomberg TV, Yusuf Gamal El-Din.
Good morning, everybody. Sabah al-Khair, Duyuf al-Kiram. It's great to have you here in what will be one of the most stimulating conversations at the Future Investment Initiative. Coming here to Riyadh, I put in a lot of thought about infrastructure. It's a bit of a heavy word, but still we get inspired by it. We think of what do you think about when you think of infrastructure? Do you think about size because it's so big and it's an engineering marvel? Do you think about the noise it makes because it's so loud? What is it about infrastructure that really inspires us? And it's actually because it serves such an amazing purpose to so many people, right? If you think of an airport, millions and millions of people use that airport throughout the year. You think about some of the other infrastructure, like hospitals. They serve a purpose that goes far, far beyond borders. And that is actually the special feeling that we have and the special respect we have for infrastructure. That's what we're going to talk about today. Building a new world, new infrastructure. How can we make it happen? What's the real issue that we're facing? You might have heard of the $1 trillion infrastructure gap. That's sort of the number that's being thrown around. Crumbling bridges, broken highways, delays, slow internet, the list goes on and on and on and on. But it's not all doom and gloom. There's some really exciting projects out there, and there are ways to fix the process to deliver more of the infrastructure so that we can do this kind of economic transformation, right? That's what we need, a flourishing infrastructure. So what I'd like to know from you now is, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to getting infrastructure projects done and delivered? We've got 5 options for you to choose from, and you can vote with your app, the FII app on your phone. So here's what we're looking at. The greatest obstacle to accelerating smart infrastructure around the world. So we just made it a bit fancier in the question. Is it financial capital? Is it intellectual capital, advanced technology, business leadership, or government leadership? So if you could please vote now, after thinking about it for 13 and a half seconds. I have to say, that's stressful decision making. Okay, so this is the result. Government leadership by a majority, 64% of you think that. Followed by financial capital, 16%, and then we've got advanced technology with 12.5%. 5.4% think it's business leadership, and intellectual capital. Clearly, a lot of smart people readily available to the market, so that's good news. We're going to redo this poll after our conversation, because now we're going to get 3 business leaders on the stage who will give us some more context about how we can fix some of these issues. I'd like to welcome on the stage 3 people who actually need very little introduction. We're joined today by Brendan Bechtel, who's the chairman and chief executive officer of the Bechtel Group. Brendan, of course, is the 5th generation of the Bechtel family to lead the company. We've got Bruce Flatt. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Brookfield Asset Management. That's the leading alternative asset manager. They've got $250 billion in assets under management. Rajendra Raj Rao, he's the CEO of Ford Smart Mobility, is with us as well. He basically leads the Ford subsidiary working on designing and building and growing emerging mobility services. And yeah, so that is the lineup that we have. Let me start with you, Bruce. You just saw the results. Why is it so hard to get infrastructure done? I mean, it clearly inspires people.
So the first thing I'm going to say is that if after, this is really dangerous, if after it comes up that the problem is business, I think it's going to focus on the three of us. And that's a real problem. But I would just say that, look, we have a lot of infrastructure programs around the world, and where most of the infrastructure we own is in the emerging markets. And it's because originally they didn't have capital to do projects, so government needed the capital, so they went to private enterprise. So I'd say the best thing is in markets that need capital, they have an impetus to do it. In the developed economies, it's just tough because usually leaders don't choose to make the decisions with short mandates. And so where people have vision, I think what's going on now in the kingdom is tremendous, because what's happening is if you have the push from the top and if you have leadership, you will do it. And it's definitely the right thing to do, because in many, many ways, private infrastructure is the way to go, because it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's better maintained, and it gets it off the balance sheet of the governments.
The problem is as well that most of the developed world, or at least in a lot of places in the world, the political conversation revolves around election coming up very soon, so we got to prep for that, and there's no longer term thinking. Brendan, you've got exposure to a lot of different parts of the world. This political risk, this lack of political leadership, how far high on the agenda does that rank for you in terms of obstacles to delivery?
I think it's a huge issue. So most of the kinds of projects that Bechtel works on are anywhere from a 3 to, in some cases, 10-year-long projects that would span multiple administrations, for example. So I think if you had asked the polling question about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia specifically, I think you would have gotten a very different answer. And that's why, as a company, we're so excited about the opportunity here in Saudi Arabia. And I think that the very strong and enthusiastic government leadership around a long-term vision for infrastructure and the stability that enables that is a huge differentiator in the global competition for having strong infrastructure, which is really the backbone of social and economic development. And I think specifically an interesting way to illustrate that is to look at next year will be our 75th anniversary in Saudi Arabia. 75 years of continuous work here in the kingdom. And our history in the kingdom, I think, is a good illustration of the kind of development through infrastructure that's happened. So in the 40s and 50s, oil pipelines, jetties, basic civil infrastructure like railways. In the 70s, Jubail, which used to be a fishing village, and today, 40 years later, is the largest industrial city of the Middle East and represents a significant portion of the kingdom's non-oil GDP. So pretty exciting. And then today you have things like Riyadh Metro, National Project Management Office.
That really leads to the next question, which is how exactly do business leaders and governments need to evolve from here to build on, I mean, you just singled out Saudi Arabia as being on the front line of that progress. Arguably, some countries like the United States are on the back foot in terms of setting the tone for infrastructure. Raj, what's your view on this? I mean, you're trying to create smart cities, and that needs a lot of political support. I mean, what would you like to see more from the political leaders and from the business leaders as well? I mean, we can't just all say it's the politics.
I think we're at a point, what's notionally called the tipping point, where the notion of fixed capacity, what's called the transport infrastructure, is breaking, simply because I think people now want mobility infrastructure, not transport infrastructure. And I think the tension, whether it's Jakarta, whether it's Buenos Aires or Shanghai, where the tension comes from congestion and pollution, right? So the aspiration being we want to be connected, shared electric in the future, and the investments that have been made is fixed and not flexible. And how do you transform that so that you go from a transport to mobility? And mobility, by definition, Yusuf, means less of owned and more of shared. so that I can, on demand, use mobility in a multimodal setting. So cities become more livable. So when you look at aspirational cities like Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto and Melbourne, which rank right up there in the top 4, we find that government, so I like that poll you did earlier. I think governments is the proxy for citizenship. So governance basically is governance of what? It's governance of citizenship. And citizens want that freedom and to escape from fixed capacity.
Yeah.
So that's what we are observing. And when we talk about smart cities and smart transport networks, the fundamental view is a human view. You know, what's the experience that people want to have when they utilize that infrastructure?
I mean, you mentioned some of the cities as examples, and I want to go to not just Canada, I want to go to what happened in Asia over the past, because Saudi Arabia is not the first country to do an economic transformation. It's not the first country to be engaging in ambitious infrastructure projects. What can we learn from the Asia experience? And I'm thinking especially along the lines of China, who are also moving boldly, and they're moving quickly and rapidly, and they keep surprising a lot of the skeptics out there. What can we learn from them that could be applied to other parts of the world? Bruce, would you?
You know, we always look at 2 facts when we think of urban infrastructure, and that's that in Asia-Pac, the population of middle-class people is going from 1.3 billion to 3.5 billion in the next 20 years. That's a staggering statistic. And 65% of the population by 2050 is going to be in urban centers around the world. And the reason is that corporations want to have their people in these cities, and young people want to live in cities. And if you look at what 25 years ago with our business in New York City, people lived in the suburbs. Today, everyone wants to live in the city, and that's because the young population that drives business wants all of the things that go along in an urban environment. And that's happening across the world. So we continue to see the densification, and that what that means is technologies and transportation has to go along with it. And it is. These cities are getting better and better. So we often complain about all the things in past. There are some incredible examples of what's going on around the world of the urbanization, the densification. Shanghai, some of the major cities in the world, and they're going to get better and better when you look at what's going on in a global context.
And when you look at
so can I just build on that, because I think it's a very good point. Because I think what we are seeing, what Bruce is describing, is really the generational impact that's taking place. Asia and obviously the Middle East has a very young user base who love connected things. And I think by definition, they want things to be a lot more technology savvy. And I think their expectation is that things will move at the pace that they want to move. And that's the expectation that they have. And they're also very entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
They know, when we think about the Ubers and the Olas of the world and Didi, these are creating entrepreneurs, and they're self-taught. They're not going to school to learn how to use a phone to get a ride or to supply a ride. They just learn enough to be resilient because they have the entrepreneurial instinct. So I think we overplay, let's educate people, let's send them to school, let's teach them this and that. People are really self-taught, especially the younger group. They rely on knowledge from each other, and it's a network effect. So I think we have to recognize that.
Here's what I take issue with. Does anybody know how much China spends on infrastructure as a percentage of GDP?
45.
No, it's not 45. It's more than 10% of GDP that China is spending on infrastructure. It's a similar story for a lot of the other emerging markets in Asia. You look at what's happening in this part of the world, and the infrastructure spend in many cases is less than 5% of GDP. How do you reconcile that? And I'm gonna take this back to you, Brendan. Not just in terms of what the government needs to do in terms of spending, but also in terms of how they structure the projects. Because the Chinese, these are the latest figures. 13,000 PPP projects worth $2.5 trillion were registered as of June, which shows you again the scale of prioritization that's happening there.
Yeah, so I'll maybe answer your prior question a little bit as well in addressing this one. So I think to compare and contrast a bit. So huge levels of spending in China, as a company that has done some work in China, but frankly not been able to do a lot. a lesson learned from that experience that shows up very warmly in Vision 2030 from our perspective is this whole concept of inclusion in the process of development. And the felt experience of having worked in the kingdom for a very long time, but I would say particularly in the last few years, is a real spirit of partnership and a desire to have the best companies from all over the world help with this incredibly ambitious plan and have it be achievable. It's specifically called out in Vision 2030. And you know, I would be curious to see how that definition of public-private partnership in China compares to what's laid out in the Vision 2030 framework, which I think is very progressive, or in the United States or other places where it's a more accessible market to companies from outside that country. And I think that's been a very generous and participative approach that has been taken here.
In terms of capital and technological innovations, just to think and go back to our polling at the beginning of our conversation, Raj, and I'm going to bring this to you to start sort of the tech element of it all. What exactly is needed to really unleash a new catalyst in infrastructure spend from a technological point of view?
Well, I think, you know, I think there are three principles. One is inclusiveness. So data, by definition, should not be siloed. So if there's a transit infrastructure that's being deployed, or if there's capacity for mobility being deployed, that data that is used to do scheduling of that, payment, governance, should all be in the cloud, so to speak, and allow entrepreneurs to tap into that so that they can innovate. So that inclusiveness is, I think, the first principle. The second is the government participation. I think our experience with, you know, we do city hackathons, where we work with the mayor of the city, and we work with policy planners and stakeholders to come together and convene a conversation about what needs to change or what needs to be put in place. So that aspect of creating that collaborative framework is the second part of it. And third is really funding. I think, you know, a lot of these ideas require intervention of funding. And I think, you know, we're talking here about public-private sector partnership. I think that's the key here is these scenarios are going to require someone to fund the transformation journey, and I think those are things that I think
you hit the nail on the head with the funding, because that is one of the biggest challenges that infrastructure faces, especially in light of increased regulation, right? So with the new Basel set of rules, with the rules that apply to the insurance companies, hey, are the banks going to give, you know, these projects money? It's unlikely, is it, Bruce?
No, I slightly disagree with just the point on bankable projects. If projects are in good locations and they have infrastructure and you can build it out, there is enormous amounts of money in the world. Today, the amount of capital that's sitting in institutional plans globally is $40 trillion. It's going to be $80 trillion just by compound math and money flowing in the next while. People are sitting on bonds at 2%. Infrastructure is the thing to invest in, so there is lots of money out there. What's needed is projects to transfer into that form, and what's difficult for most people is they don't have the intellectual capital and the people to be able to deploy the assets to make it into a project.
Yeah, so there's a clear mismatch between what the banks need to make it happen and between the requirements of the individual
Or most
partners.
of that institutional capital, what they don't have is it's money, and they can buy a project that's complete and it's leased for 30 years. What they can't do is, we bought a business in Brazil and it was 2,000 kilometers of toll roads, and we're adding 3,000 kilometers to the end of it. So we're building 3,000 kilometers of toll roads. That's not easy for most money to do. And so the differentiation is this, the gap is there's lots of money, there's lots of need. The gap is how do you convert for this side over into, get the money into actual projects which are long-term and leased. Yeah. And that's where government needs to come in. Bechtel can come in, but investors with expertise to actually be the developer of the projects is what's really required in that middle.
I just wanted to enthusiastically agree with what Bruce had to say and add a bit of nuance to it. So there's funding and financing are not interchangeable things, right? So and I agree with the core concept, which is that there's an abundance of capital that really actively wants to be invested in infrastructure projects. There's pent up over $3 trillion in pent up infrastructure demand globally. There's $2 trillion alone over the next 10 years in the US. So why isn't that market clearing? And the market isn't clearing, in my view, because of what you talked about, which is that there are sophisticated investors that want to invest, but they have choices around the world. And they're going to gravitate towards high-performing, P3-oriented, private investment-friendly places from an infrastructure places like Canada and Australia, from which I think the U.S. could actually take some lessons. We have a lot of investor capital sitting on the sidelines in the U.S. right now that wants to invest in infrastructure.
That's institutional investor capital?
Predominantly institutional. You want investors with a long-term time horizon because, as you said, these are 30-year assets, right? Yeah. So you need to have that kind of mindset. But I do think the exciting thing is that you saw the poll earlier talking about government leadership needed. Wherever that government leadership occurs, you're going to see a surge in private capital inflows into infrastructure, assuming that the policy frameworks back up that invitation to invest.
So Raj, how then, just to build on Brendan's point, how can you, business leaders or whoever else in sort of the societal spectrum, what can be done to reduce the risks that are associated with infrastructure investment from where you're standing right now?
Well, I think it's a planning function. If you can anticipate demand and be able to drive revenue from the demand, I think that's what needs to be done. And you think about the vision, Saudi 2030 vision. I think it's anticipating the emergence of a new class of citizens that want to consume services in the future in a different way than they're consuming currently. I think that's the key, is to be able to look accurately at how will these services be consumed. And I think creating that framework, that is a regulatory framework around governing that consumption, I think is key. We struggle with this sometimes because we have launched new mobility projects in frameworks that aren't built to govern those kind of services. And you run into this inherent conflict. Do we allow entrepreneurship in mobility, or do we stay clear of that and let public transit make that investment? So I think that conflict needs to be addressed as well, because that revenue stream that comes from these new infrastructure projects can be stifled if the regulatory framework doesn't allow it to really self-determine.
That's absolutely critical. And in my conversations with a few other business leaders before this panel, in doing my sort of due diligence, the feedback was that the increased regulation, and I'm going to go back to the Basel and the solvency rules and so forth, they're putting a tighter rope in terms of capacity and ability to invest in certain ways. It's become more complicated, and then goes back to your point as well, Bruce, in terms of the intellectual capital to make the mismatch happen.
The only thing I'd say is, you're talking about banking system, and what's happened in the last 15 years is that the institutional pools of capital have formed, and they really don't need the banking system to fund those projects. What you need is people to actually build the projects and own the projects and be this intermediary in between. The banking system, no disrespect, I love all the banks, but the fact is, and they have constrained them, but the institutional money around the world is
so that is your pension funds, your sovereign wealth funds,
all of those institutional money around the world, and really what's happened is the institutional allocations to real assets, being real estate and infrastructure, 20 years ago was 0. 10 years ago, it was 5%. Today, it's heading to 15 to 20%, and we think it's going to 40%. And the reason for that is that interest rates are 0 in Japan, 50 basis points in Germany, and 2% in the United States. And these type of assets can earn 6 to 15%, and that's why it's going there. So it's not lack of money. It's the intermediaries to make sure the projects can get built, owned, and run.
I was just going to say, I look at this challenge from the perspective of an investor as well. Bechtel, we don't just build projects. Occasionally, we'll make equity investments, and so at a much more humble scale than Brookfield would. But if I have the choice between, so the specific challenge from our perspective is the front-end development, particularly the permitting process, and how that varies in different places. So if I have to choose between investing hard-earned capital in the US, where for a typical P3 mega project, that front-end process may be 10 years, subject to a lot of political risk, over which, as a private company, we have no control, versus a place like Canada, where it averages about 2 years and has a very sophisticated government agency that can help you navigate all that process. You know, we have choices. We're investing more heavily in P3 projects in Canada than we are at home in the US. That's why, you know, one of the policy approaches that has changed is the US government has said, we want to, if we can go from a 10-year average permitting process, front-end development, to 2 years, that'll unlock $1 trillion in economic value over the next 5 years alone.
In terms of the types of projects, just to tie everything together a little bit, what are the kinds of projects that are going to get investors the returns that they're looking for, Raj?
I think it's flexible capacity. I think fixed infrastructure capacity, you know, as Bruce said, you know, the returns will justify the investment. But I think what's going to capture the imagination of people is really adding mobility capacity that is truly flexible and is more driven by user rather than a planner. So I think being able to provide that kind of outcome, whether it's, you know, we've invested, for example, in bike sharing in San Francisco, right? I mean, you wouldn't think of automotive company being interested in that. But the reason you do things like that is because you want to get closer and closer to the user and understand how they want to engage. And I think that those are the kind of projects that I think are going to get the most attention, because it is an entrepreneur that's going to put that team together, that's going to put the spade in the ground and make things happen, and leverage that new capacity in a new way to provide greater services. And I think that's what we feel is identify those entrepreneurs, find a way of investing in them, and then give them the tools that they need to be successful and scale over time.
It's also the complexity of infrastructure. I mean, it's such a wide net that you cast in terms of the types of projects and the location and the financing and everything else. Bruce, what's been high on your radar in terms of attractive infrastructure plays, let's call it that?
Look, I think I'm going to say this more positively about, instead of just making all the complaints. We've been in we think it's a 30-year transformation of the global infrastructure backbone that's out there. 15 years ago, every piece of infrastructure in the world was owned by a government. 20 years from today, virtually all infrastructure, with quotations around it, very significant amounts of infrastructure around the world are going to be owned by private enterprise. And it's just a compendium. We need more people like us who put money in, build infrastructure, and own it longer term. We need more people like Bechtel. We need other infrastructure providers. And we need the capital, and we just need the institutional money to understand infrastructure. When a client of ours owns a toll road, or a pipeline, or a railway, or a power plant with us, and they're successful, the next time someone comes to them, they're pleased to invest because they've been successful. And that's what transforms an industry. And so I would say 20 years from now, when we're sitting here today, having this panel, again, it will be totally different. And it's just time. And we all want it to happen faster. And it will happen, I think, exponentially faster as it goes along. Because we've now had all of our clients. We started putting infrastructure into our clients' funds 15 years ago, and it was hard to do it. We raised a $14 billion fund. Our last fund was for infrastructure. It was just a private pool capital. It was $14 billion. So it's dramatically changed in 10 years. The next 20 will be very significant. A lot of it will be outside.
Brendan, I want to hear from you a little bit more about not just the types of projects, but also like the new markets that you are focusing on. I mean, you've got quite a long list of countries. What are you excited about?
Yeah, so when we identify markets in which we're really interested in either investing or surging our talent towards those markets to help with project delivery, there are a couple factors that we look at. So the first is, which we've talked about already, political will. Is there a desire and is there enough stability in the political system that it can be consistent over the duration of a project? The second, which falls out of that, would be, are there policy frameworks that enable and encourage the private sector to participate in the development and the delivery? The third thing is a function of how sophisticated are those in the project environment? Are there sophisticated investors? Are there strong local contractors and designers who can help with the delivery of the project in addition to us? Is there a whole supply chain which can help, are there opportunities for us to develop that supply chain and upskill people? Another key input that we look at is the overall environment such that we can really help bring a one-team mindset to getting a project done. So what I mean by that, it's sort of the softer side of how you make big mega projects successful. It really takes a partnership. It takes a partnership between the government leadership. It was everything on the polling slide. Government leadership, there's always an agency that's tasked with specifically delivering these big public works. You need to have alignment with them, with the contractor, with the local community, and that requires early engagement and really good collaboration and feedback. So, and on the private sector side, again, I think that's a function of sophistication. Those are and so specific geographies, I would say Australia, Canada, those are two really exciting places for us in the developed world, in more developing economies. I would say, we just won a big motorway project in Kenya. Public-private partnership in Kenya, and of course here in Saudi Arabia, it's the natural evolution of the investment that's been happening.
I'm looking at some of the infrastructure spends for other countries and regions. You're looking at, over the next 10 years, the UK will commit £500 billion. You've got Germany, they're looking at 270 billion euros. But despite these investments, that is actually still not up to the same level than it was pre-crisis, which is fascinating. It's actually mind-boggling to say the least. Raj, what markets are you focusing on and why?
Well, I think, India, where I spent some time last week talking about City of Tomorrow, I think they are trying to create 120 smart cities. The quote I got from the government was pretty interesting. They said India hasn't urbanized yet. So don't be critical of infrastructure because we really haven't made the decision. And they're talking about, vehicle ownership is 20 per thousand. In the US is 900 per thousand. And that's led to gridlock and congestion and pollution issues. They want a different future. So we want to be part of that. So when a country has a bold vision of where it wants to go and create a transformational outcome from that process, that for us is very inspiring. So whether it's China or India and obviously now Saudi, we want to be part of that aspiration that the country has to lead that change that needs to take place. So that's where my time and focus is. Obviously back in the US and in Europe, there are new modes of transport being introduced. And we're trying to drive the investment in making them, whether it's AVs or whether it's bike sharing, we're getting into those spaces as well.
In this part of the world had a bit of a hard time across industries with the fall in oil prices over the last few years. I mean, now they're back in the range $50 to $60 a barrel, but that's still not the complete rebound, and it's still hard going. So with the fiscal reforms that are happening, not just in the kingdom, but elsewhere in the region. Bruce, just give us some context about how the region fits into your view of the world in terms of, I'm not talking in terms of potential opportunities, in terms of real opportunities.
Yeah, look, I'd say this part of the world is it's going to be one of the great growing places because it has a middle class that's growing and a young population. And what that means is that significant infrastructure is needed. So we've been in the Middle East for 15 years. We have a large construction business, and we continue to build out many of the cities in this region. And what we usually do is do that first and then start investing into infrastructure ourselves. So we've now started doing that in the region. And this market will be very significant longer term, in particular, obviously, Saudi Arabia, just given the size and scale of it.
Brendan, are you looking to expand your footprint in this part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say if we think back on our 75-year history in Saudi Arabia, there's never been a more exciting time for us than right now and what the future looked like. The leadership shown in Vision 2030, the inclusivity, the specific focus on bringing the private sector to help with delivering this incredibly ambitious but achievable blueprint for the future. We've never seen anything like it in the world, and we've done 25,000 projects in 160 countries. This is, we are so enthusiastic about this, and I think that the real challenge is how quickly can everybody get mobilized to actually help deliver it.
Raj, some closing thoughts about how...
I want to pick up. I don't think, I don't think that's going to be the challenge. I think, everything I've experienced this trip and my team is just amazingly inspiring. So I think when people get inspired, they get going. You get passionate about something, you want to see it come to life. So I don't worry about how quickly it'll come to life. I think it's the question of what outcome has been imagined. You talked about the blueprint. right? What's the outcome? What's the human view of all this? I think we can't lose that. I mean, what do we want people to feel when this thing comes to life? Because if you can imagine that and get people rallying behind it, I think the world's going to be here. And I'm really excited about that, actually, Yusuf. You know, I can't wait to go back and start getting started.
I mean, the speed of changes, just to bring it back to the local story, and we've been covering this over the last few days, doing the shows live from Riyadh at Bloomberg TV, and just over the last 3 days, there's been a series of announcements across sectors and across the economy, and it just underscores that at the moment, this is a country and a government that is on a bullet train of reform, and they are serious about the promises that they've made. Let's leave it there for the moment because we want to bring back in our audience and do another quick poll to see whether any of our esteemed panelists have been able to sway you one way or the other. So if we could bring up our 5 options again. What is the greatest obstacle to accelerating smart infrastructure? So just a quick reminder, we had financial capital, which, again, there wasn't a lot of strong support for that point on the panel. Intellectual capital, advanced technology, business leadership, and government leadership. And I'm not going to comment any further on that. Otherwise, I might push you one way or the other. Okay, so if you could please vote now, we'll give you another 15. We only give you 15 seconds to make a decision. That's outrageous.
Are we doing the selfie? You're not doing the selfie. Oh, even more.
Okay, look at that.
Okay, so clearly the majority became more of a majority. So from 64 to 73, I think government leadership is the issue. Bruce, we got lucky. Business leadership is not an issue.
Thank you.
Advanced tech, a bit less, and intellectual capital jumped quite a bit there. And financial capital, I did not get my point across. No, I didn't. So a little bit less there as well. Let's give the panel a big round of applause. Thank you very much. And a big thank you as well for your time and your patience and for being such a great audience. And have a great day. Enjoy what's left of the FII.